Uh, Thanks everyone for coming to session 2, topic 2 of Thinking Through Photographs, our virtual reading group. I'm David Oresic. I'm your host for the evening. I'm the director of Silverai as well. And basically everyone with a yellow background is someone helping to produce this event tonight. So we're really happy you're here. Welcome back if you came to the first event a couple weeks ago. I think we learned a lot, and I think we had a really good time, and I'm personally really excited to go in and do it again. So before we get started, I'll just kind of remind everyone of the format for this virtual reading group, which is basically we have a guest facilitator for each topic, and tonight's facilitator is Dan Leers, so I'll introduce him in a second. So Dan will kind of prime the pump for our discussion. He's got a couple thoughts on both the readings, and he's got a couple of image examples and artwork examples to get us thinking about some of these topics together that he's put together in a slideshow. So he'll present a little bit of his initial thoughts on the reading, and then we'll transition into our group discussion like we did last time. And again, for the group discussion, feel free to engage in whatever way you're most comfortable. You can raise your hand in the participants list. You can just kind of unmute yourself and pipe up. Or you can use the chat. And last time the chat was really interesting to respond to people. And I'll be kind of scanning the chat. And if you say something interesting, just fair warning, I'm probably going to read it to the group and ask you to elaborate or ask, try to moderate as much as one can a Zoom discussion with 50 some people. So great to see you all. And I'll give the briefest of introductions. Dan Leers is the curator of photography at the Carnegie Museum of Art here in Pittsburgh, and he is also the leader of the Hillman Photography Initiative, which I think Dan can tell us more about, and is quite, this cycle is quite relevant to this topic. I will just keep it really brief. So Dan Leers, why don't you introduce the excess of photographs, excess of images. No,
thanks,
photographs.
Thank you, David, and thanks to everyone on the call, especially our hosts, University of Buffalo Art Gallery. Thanks to everyone there, and to Liz and her team for putting together this excellent reader, and of course thanks to David and Kate and the team at Silverai for inviting me and for convening this reading group. I think it feels very topical and timely, and this particular, this week's readings in particular, I think are very relevant to some of the work that I've been doing for the last 2 years or so, and of course very relevant to our current image saturated moment. I think what I'll probably do is start by talking about a couple projects that I have either seen recently or worked on recently that in the course of these readings came up and felt particularly relevant to me. And then I'll show some artworks that are forthcoming in a project that we're working on through the Hillman Photography Initiative, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And I'm pretty flexible here, so I'm happy to be interrupted or have people, as David said, adding things in the chat here, raising their hands, speaking out in order to keep the conversation moving. And I think we did talk about the fact that given the subject matter of this week's readings, that we should note again to people that this session is being recorded, and by participating, by attending, you consent to that recording. And I'll also say this was, I thought, I don't know if this was what this was, but when David shared the recording from last week's session, which is subtitled, when he introduced himself, he said, "I'm David Oresic," and the subtitle said "David Arrested." And I'm a cynic, I guess, and my initial thought was, the subtitling for this must have been done by some AI assisted program. And of course, not knowing the name Arrestic, it just immediately assumed that it had to do with law enforcement and police monitoring, and so it just inserted arrested instead, which is probably one of its more frequently used terms. So that's probably a good introduction to some of the things that we'll be talking about today. But without further ado, I will start showing some pictures. And this first image here is an exhibition that I saw at SF MoMA last year called Snap Plus Shares, Transmitting Photographs from Mail Art to Social Networks. And this got a fair amount of attention, in part because it was a very large monolithic institution trying to react somewhat quickly and nimbly to a lot of trends that were taking place, that are continuing to take place in terms of image sharing. And of course it did that with some historical context and talking about things like postcards and mail art. But it also, I think, had some very convincing installations like this piece, Eric Kessel's 24 Hours in Photos, which he originally, I guess, performed, you would say, in 2011, but which they recreated here. And it consists of Kessel's printing out every single image uploaded to Flickr in the course of 24 hours. And of course, when you see it printed out and assembled into this mountainous installation within the museum galleries, you start to grasp maybe just a tip of the iceberg of how many images there are circulating in our world today. And visitors were encouraged to walk through this space. You could pick up these pictures and look through them if you wanted to. I've seen installation views where people are kind of lying on the pile of photos and picking them up, and the idea of trying to emphasizing the tactility and the sheer physicality of these photographs was a big part, I think, of Kessel's process and practice. And I think, there's no way to possibly flip through all of these images or look at all of these images. And that's kind of the point. We enter our photographs into this constant stream of images, and once they're there, they just kind of get lost. Rarely do we ourselves go back to them unless we're prompted by a program that says, hey, look what happened. And do we print them out? So that kind of disjoint between the digital life of a photograph and the physical life of a photograph was really significantly changed. And I think in 2011 even, it felt probably a bit newer than it does today. But I think this paradigm shift that digital photography initiated in the world is something that we're still grappling with. And then personally, on a project that I worked on in 2011 when I was a curatorial fellow at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, this was a new photography show, and I know this exhibition program was talked about last week in the context of Carmen Winant's piece, which I think is also very relevant to our conversation today. And I didn't bring it because I think probably most of you are familiar with it, and absolutely we should talk about it. But in 2011, I included 5 different photographers, including Doug Rickard, whose work I show here. And this was part of a project called American Suburb X. And it consisted of Rickard working in his studio, which was also basically his living room, and walking the streets of different cities using Google Street View. And once he found a view that was particularly interesting or compelling to him, he would photograph it and then make a print of that photograph. So the project is to a large extent about the saturation of images that occurs through things like Google Images or Google Street View, and the mapping functions that that are now so prevalent in our lives. And his point was that even just sitting in his living room in California, where he's based, he could travel the entire world if he wanted to, and he also is not, he's making a photograph, but it's not his own picture, right? He's appropriating a picture that it comes much more out of a corporate context than out of any sort of artistic one. And for that reason, he focuses on the adverse impact of, let's call it, rampant capitalism in America, and photographs areas of cities that are particularly low income and underserved. So he would go to places like Baltimore and Chicago and Philadelphia, and oftentimes when searching in Google, he would use terms like Martin Luther King Boulevard or Malcolm X Avenue, and almost invariably those streets exist in predominantly African American communities, and again, predominantly underserved communities. And so some of the hope and justice that those figures represented are contradicted by the realities of the streets that as they appear today, or at least as they appeared in 2007 and 2011 when Rickard was making these pictures. And so he would pull up on full screen the image that he found compelling, photograph it, and print it out. And then you start to notice weird inconsistencies, like Google has an algorithm where it's supposed to block faces and blur them out, but it's a computer program, and so it messes up. And in this case, you can see, rather than blurring this person's head, and you'll have to excuse the image. In person, these were fairly clear, and you could certainly make out individuals, but here it's more like his feet and maybe his shopping bag that are blurred out because the algorithm made a mistake. And so this idea also of privacy and a reasonable expectation of privacy, I think, are raised in this work. And the fact that this figure is standing underneath a sign that says "super fair" in the midst of a society that is anything but is not lost on the artist. So how this plays out in some of the projects that we've been working on at the Carnegie relate to a program called the Hillman Photography Initiative, which was founded about 6 years ago now to really explore cutting edge or contemporary issues in photography, often through what I would call non-traditional or the program operates in two and stable. Hopefully I'm not frozen. Okay, so we're in that later. Looking at what they call the life cycle of photography and how images circulated in, well, let's say now 2015 or 14. And I think another important part of this conversation, and again, it's one that I think started to get teased out a little bit last week, is photography in books. And this becomes an arena of images that when you go onto Amazon or when you go into a bookstore, back when we could do those things, one is immediately overwhelmed by the sheer volume of publications out there. And Silverhead does a great job of hosting their annual book fair, and you realize just how many pictures there are that are circulating in a physical context, but circulating within books. And it begs the question of who's reading these things, how many of them are being opened and looked at and actively circulated. So I thought that this particular subject was very timely and appropriate for this conversation. And so one element of the first cycle of programming through the Hillman Photography Initiative was called the Sandbox. And this was done in collaboration with Melissa and Ed at Spaces Corners, which created basically a live reading room with a curated selection of books, photography books that people could come in, and there were some seats and they could peruse the books. And then also what you're seeing in the, if I can use my cursor here, this kind of left-hand corner of the gallery was a projection of images that were shared by members of the public, uploaded from their own personal archives. And what resulted after a number of images were uploaded both online and also in person. There were scanning events that people that happened at the museum and elsewhere where people could bring their pictures, and if they didn't have a scanner, they could be helped by Ed and Melissa to scan their images. And then Ed and Melissa worked together to put together this book that you're seeing here, A People's History of Pittsburgh, which I think is a really fascinating model for curatorial work, certainly, but also for trying to wade through images and trying to share what otherwise would be very private images, either kept in family archives or digitized and never looked at, and bringing them into a physical sphere. And this book is still available. It's very accessible. It's a pretty small trim size. So and I think it's a brilliant idea also of trying but love is an important part, and rather is part of the conversation. Exhibition that I actually organized at the Carnegie was called Strength in Numbers, Photography in Groups. So clearly, these are things that I've been thinking about for quite some time now. And I'm going to be, and I'll just go over it, assuming that it can buffer, that one of the works that we included in this exhibition, which really thought about what can a group of photographers do that a single image can't, and almost contradicting this idea that one picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, if that's the case, then are 5 pictures worth, 5,000 words? And is there some sort of, is there some sort of exponential growth? The piece that I think most aptly applies to the topic for this week is Penelope Umbrico's Sunsets from Flickr. And it's also interesting that Flickr appears in 2 artworks that I'm showing here. It's a website that I feel like is completely outdated. I never use it. I don't upload pictures to it, but it is still, I think, a very dominant form of sharing images for a lot of people. It essentially consisted of hundreds of photographs that Umbrico pulled from Flickr after using what she found to be the most common tag applied to images, which was sunsets. And, one term that actually doesn't get, here you're seeing an installation view of it, and maybe I can just back it up a little bit, an installation view of it in our galleries. One term that didn't really interesting to discuss is cliche. If something is cliche? Can everyone hear me? By the way, my internet's so bad, but it sort of begs the question that if everyone in the world is taking pictures of themselves, and albeit in this case very poorly exposed backlit shots of sunsets, is there really a need to upload another image of that same subject to the digital world? I mean, do we need more pictures of these things? And if so, what is our contribution doing differently than from anything else? And that's where also we get into this conversation of sort of fine art, I guess, versus vernacular, and the sort of everyday usage of images. I have a problem with the term vernacular, I'll just say from the outset, but maybe we'll call them everyday images versus images in a different context. And I think that's what Umbrico so brilliantly pulls out here is that even with the thousands of pictures of crappy pictures of sunsets that are out there, one can create something really beautiful and transcendent, and maybe one could even get closer to some kind of platonic ideal of a sunset, more so than could ever happen by a single picture of a sunset hanging in a museum. And so I think it's a really rich conversation, and it has particular impact for somebody like me working in an institution where we're always grappling with, well, how do we make this transition from things that were born digital to a gallery wall? People don't come to museums to look at a screen and see a Twitter feed, for example. So how do we create a viewing experience that's going to be compelling, that could still potentially comment on or participate in the digital movement? All right, so from there, hopefully we can go to the next slide. No, I don't want to watch the video again. And now you're probably seeing a trend here of lots of pictures installed on a wall from Eric Kessel's, where they're actually piled up, but lots and lots of pictures. And I should also say that we made Penelope's installation with just drugstore prints, right? She sends us the files, and then we upload them to the Walgreens website, and it gets harder and harder to find a place that actually prints photographs. But then we go to the drugstore and we pick them up, and they cost 15 cents a picture, and we pin them on the wall. And again, I'll tell you right off the bat, I'm not going to tell you exactly how much we paid, but we certainly paid more than if you were to charge 15 cents per picture and multiply that by however many pictures are in that piece. We paid much more than that for that artwork. But this idea of the kind of preciousness of photography is again directly contradicted by digital imagery as it exists today. And the amount of time and effort and manpower that is needed to catalog and acquire a work of art that involves lots of pictures, and you saw how many people were needed to pull off that installation, and the laser levels, and the 3M control strips, and it's honestly, it's a bit of a folly that we're trying to communicate this idea with something that exists, that was made almost exclusively digitally. But that exactly is what's happened here with Trevor Paglen's work. And this was an installation that I saw also last year, or sorry, at the beginning of this year, prior to COVID, called From Apple to Anomaly, that appeared at the Barbican's Curve Gallery in London. And as you can tell, it's a giant installation of drugstore prints pinned up on the wall. These are all actual prints tacked up, and they are organized by search terms that appear in kind of universally accepted data sets. And a data set is a group of images that are used by computer programmers or software engineers to train artificially intelligent algorithms. And so there is an entire dictionary of words that are used by these programmers to categorize images and then train their algorithms to learn those categories. So you're seeing some of them here, and you can probably make them out, like accused. Some of them are a little more whimsical, cat fancier, and then you see pictures of people holding cats and other cats, and that's kind of fun. But then you see accused, and you're like, okay, there happen to be a lot more pictures of Black people and people of color in this grouping. Like, why is that? Why is it that some algorithm suddenly assumes that when I use the search term accused, it's going to start pulling in more faces of color? And then you get up here to, very problematic terms like anti-Semite, and this idea that there is someone, many people in the world out there, saying, first of all, that we need to create an ability to identify an anti-Semite, and then trying to find a way to quantify what is an anti-Semite photographically. You realize how problematic, how quickly this technology becomes, and in part, it's directly rooted in the very binary nature of computers. The pictures are trained to see. Computers are trained to see that either something is or is not, and I'll use that great reference from Silicon Valley of not hot dog, right? Something is either not a hot dog or a hot dog, and there's no gray area. There's nothing in between. And of course, we all know that that's insane. There are so many more interesting things in the world than just hot dog or not hot dog. And life is so much more chaotic and messy and organic and interesting, that to feel like we can create a set of categories or pigeonholes or whatever you want to call them that we can use to classify and quantify our lives is just silly. And yet that is ultimately how computer programs work. And I'll tie this back directly to something that Joanna Zylinska says, where she sort of believes that, or she posits that all photographs are non-human in some way, and I think that's. I don't know actually that I agree with it. I think it's a really interesting point, but one of the reasons why I think algorithms or computer or AI or computer intelligence, whatever you want to call it, machine vision, is so interesting in the context of photography is that they, in a lot of ways, they share a similar history, and they also have, I think, experienced a similar arc in their trajectory where they both have started out very clinically. Especially with photography, it was almost a scientific pursuit, right? The camera objectively recorded whatever that it was put in front of it, and light impressed itself on the paper, and that was it. And of course, starting probably in the 1960s or maybe 1970s, conceptual artists and others started to understand, well, actually, no, there's no objectivity in photography. Just by nature of having a person behind the camera is going to impact what is photographed. And so there is an inherent subjectivity in it. And now we've almost come full circle where we all, I think, maybe to a certain level, consciously or unconsciously, distrust photographs. We know that they can be faked and filtered and staged and whatever other ways that we want to doctor them. And yet we inherently rely on them as evidence and as truth, and more so now than ever with things like, civilian documentation of police brutality, the photograph or lens-based imagery and videos have a power that they've never almost wielded before, and that comes, I think, is rooted directly in the volume of pictures. And likewise with algorithms or with artificial intelligence, it sort of starts in the 1950s as like a, hey, we just want to teach the computers how to understand our world a little bit, and it's very scientific and it's computer science. And then gradually, with things like the Turing test, it starts to be about, well, how can we actually mimic humanity with a program? And now it's to the point where, again, we are all so reliant on algorithms. I'm the first to admit that, you know, I love depositing my checks by taking a picture of them, which is entirely machine vision. And yet I constantly have to remind myself that behind every program is a person. Behind every algorithm and equation is some mathematician or group of computer scientists or programmers or whatever you want to call them, saying, well, this is important and this is not. And that subjectivity introduces fallibility. And that in and of itself, I think, is enough to have us stop and really think about the level to which we rely on algorithms or machines today, and wonder if there aren't other ways that we can sort of encourage a more human-centered way of computer work. Sorry, I know that was kind of a digression, but it's something that I think hopefully we'll pick back up in our conversation. To get back to Trevor's work, I'm showing an installation view from an exhibition that we just opened last month called Opposing Geometries, which occurs in 3 different spaces in the museum, and it will be up until March of next year. So anyone who is in Pittsburgh, I highly encourage you to come and check it out. The museum has time ticketing, and masks are required, and social distancing is in. And so if you're comfortable with that, I would encourage you to come and see the show. But within Gallery 1, our sort of temporary exhibition space in upstairs in the Scaife galleries, we have 16 photographs by Trevor installed. And I brought this one in, again, to comment on the excess of images, because it comes from a new series that Paglen's working on called Eigenfaces. And Eigenfaces they're essentially the way that machines identify faces today. And it does so by creating giant masses of images of faces and amalgamating them, and then identifying statistical differences or variations or anomalies within those massive face images to identify specific individuals. And so this is actually how Apple's Face ID algorithm works. If any of you use your face to turn on your phone, the phone, what happens is that you pick up the phone, and this camera here, and just a sidebar, one of the really amazing things about Apple phones, or most cell phones today, is that with cameras now on both sides, it doesn't matter how you put them down, there is always a camera looking out. And I think we should keep that in mind. But you look at this camera and it sprays a set of dots on your face, and creates basically a topography of your face with its camera. And then it compares that to what it has used to identify you as unique. Those biometric markers, whether it's your pupillary distance or the protrusion of your brow or the length of your nose or whatever it is that's statistically significant about you. And then it says, yes, that is in fact Dan Leers. That's his nose. I know that because I've seen 10 million noses, and no nose is exactly like Dan's. And so essentially what Paglen has done is found all of the images, scrubbed all of the images, I should say, of Simone de Beauvoir in this case, and compiled them into this very haunting picture of de Beauvoir, which highlights those elements of her face that the computer finds as statistically significant. And I mean, so I think there's a few things happening here. First off, this in no way looks like Simone de Beauvoir, and yet this is how the computer sees Simone de Beauvoir's face. Secondly, in so doing, our identities are reduced to comparisons. We can't be unique in our own right. We can't just exist because we exist. We have to exist in relationship to something else, and specifically in relationship to other images. And so that becomes, I think, particularly resonant with somebody like Simone de Beauvoir, whose entire philosophy, I guess you could say, which was such an important moment in 20th century philosophy, that in the second sex, was that women's roles within society will perpetually be subjugated to men because of the inherent comparisons that happen societally. Women are always compared to men, and therefore they will always be subjugated to them. And I know I'm oversimplifying that philosophy, but for the sake of this argument, I guess you could say that in this case, de Beauvoir's identity is also being subjugated to other individuals. It's not enough that she herself was one of the most important philosophers in history. In order to actually identify Simone de Beauvoir, we have to look at a lot of other faces first. Some of the other new works up in the show include a series called They Took the Faces from the Accused and the Dead. And I think a lot of the same things are at play here as are in play in the Eigenfaces. Paglin identified or discovered a set of, an archive of images that lives with I think it's called the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. NIST, I know, is the name, but I forget what that stands for. Anyway, you can find it online. And to ground this conversation or the analysis of this piece a little historically, these are when facial recognition was first being implemented on a wide scale, in wide scale, and really being applied in lots of different ways by companies and governments and law enforcement, there needed to be a way to test or vet the accuracy of that facial recognition. And so we're sort of in the early 1990s, I guess you could say. And the fastest way and the easiest way in which one could get a lot of pictures of different faces was mugshot archives from prisons. And so the National Institute of Standards, or NIST, whatever it's called, appropriated a massive archive of mugshots from various different places, prisons, and then used them to test early facial recognition programs. And again, I mean, this is problematic for so many reasons, but there was zero concern for who these individuals were, whether or not they had consented to their image being used for this purpose, which of course they hadn't, and kind of building a technology which would be used to police and adversely arrest communities of color by appropriating other photographs of people of color is, you know, the irony of that is just unfathomable. And so what Trevor does is pull these mugshots out of that context, draw squares around the faces so that at least the individuals are anonymized, and then keep the lines of the machine vision, what it cares about, the pupillary distance or whether or not something is symmetrical or asymmetrical, and left those markers and trying to sort of indicate that push and pull between personhood and personhood as understood by a machine. Just a couple other images that I want to bring in, and then I'll open it up because I know I've been talking a lot. When we do an image search for anything on Google, let's say, it's really easy and it's really cool and really nice. You can type in any term into Google and you can pull up thousands of pictures very quickly. What we often forget, and now I'm thinking again about the sort of human costs associated with the processing of the excess of images. The human costs are extraordinary. There's been a fair amount of coverage of Amazon Mechanical Turk, And these are essentially low-paid workers, often living in countries in the global south, places like India and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and a number of other countries where labor is cheap. Google hires these, or rather contracts these individuals, and this relates directly to Andrew Wilson Norman's piece, to perform the labor of tagging those images. And so again, the problems of the fact that these are underpaid individuals who are creating this this system of identifying images is significant, as is the fact that they all bring their own cultural experiences and life experiences to their work. And so the idea that that there could be some kind of universal system of categorizing pictures is absolutely false. One person's bird is going to be another person's flying object or whatever. And so the kinds of tags that get used and the limited lexicon that is available for those workers to use all create major problems within the sort of the excess of images, or the ocean of images as they exist online. Simon Denny is trying to draw attention to this, and this particular piece is included in a show that's up now called Uncanny Valley at the Fine Art Museums of San Francisco. And what he's done is built a scale model. So this is an actual sculpture of a patented drawing that was submitted by Amazon to create a cage for its warehouse workers. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Amazon wanted to design a cage to house its workers in their warehouses to more efficiently pick up the packages and the materials that we order and get them to us more expediently. So this design actually existed. Denny found the drawings and then created the cage itself, and then it pairs it with augmented reality, where you hold your phone up to it, and here you can see it says a King Island brown thornbill cage. You can actually sort of see birds living in this space. So he's trying to maybe repurpose this cage for something a bit more beautiful. But you know, there's so many problems. There's so many problems with this, and yet it's happening. And it's happening also, this idea of sort of increasing efficiency is rooted in photography. Early on, people like the Gilbreths, working in the 19-teens, were using photography to try to enhance efficiency in manufacturing. And to this day, there are reports that Amazon does things like monitor its workers' movements, and there have been documented cases where a worker was interrogated as to why they were using a bathroom on one floor that was significantly farther away than the bathroom that was nearer to their workstation when they were on bathroom breaks. So this level of invasiveness and this expectation of privacy that we give up as a result of video monitoring is so extreme to this point that I think something has to change. The other, maybe I'll just kind of skip over this, but one point that Joanna Zylinska doesn't bring up that I do think is relevant if people are interested in is the idea of the operational image as posited by Haroon Farokhi. And his best known piece, iMachine, looks at things like drone images and what a missile sees before it slams into its target. Farokhi is kind of making the point that so much of our vision today, especially in a military context, is machine assisted to the point where machines really make the picture. I think is important to bring up in this conversation as well. And then the last two pictures I'll show, and this is part of our ongoing Hillman Photography Initiative project. So I mentioned the Trevor Paglin installation. Here we've got an excerpt from a publication that we're doing in conjunction with this, which we're calling Mirror with a Memory, Photography, Surveillance, and Artificial Intelligence. And this is going to be a book coming out in December of this year that really explores these worlds, or these intersections of photography and surveillance and artificial intelligence. And there's a number of different contributions, artist contributions and artist commissions, poems, posters, stickers that you can use to put over your laptop camera so that you can't be surreptitiously spied upon, all kinds of different things. So stay tuned for that. But I wanted to pull out a couple projects that we're featuring in that book that I think are also very relevant to the conversation today. The first year, a rent as part of the photography exhibition. And essentially what's going on here is that Channerin created a set of photographs of England just following the most recent economic downturn by soliciting responses from Craigslist. And he calls this his kind of modern day interpretation of August Saunders' People of the 20th Century. So he's trying to create a record of British society circa 2015 or so, let's say. And what happens is that he then prints these photographs and puts them in these custom frames stacked in the floor of a gallery adjacent to these robotic arms. And what you're not seeing is that there are trackers here and in the corners of the galleries that are monitoring visitors as they enter the gallery. And the installation starts with a random selection of photographs up on the wall. And then the trackers gradually gather data about how long people spend in front of specific pictures. And based on that, it starts to prioritize those pictures which are most popular, but those pictures in which people spend the most amount of time looking. And the computer, the arm, will hang and rehang those pictures that are most popular. So again, this installation hasn't happened yet. The pictures exist. We reproduce some of them. But the piece will appear sometime, I think, next year in Europe. But again, there's this idea of surveillance, of course, but there's this idea of popularity and trending. And how is it that certain pictures or certain themes get to be popular? Who's deciding this, and what is it based on? I think all of that is very relevant to the conversation. And lastly, Mimi Onowoha. This is a still from a project called Us Aggregated. And some of you might have seen this. It actually appears as a book and as an installation. And by the way, if any of you are interested in her work, she actually coins the term algorithmic violence, which I think is so powerful. She's created an online guide called the People's Guide to AI that really simplifies a lot of the concepts behind algorithms. It's free and downloadable. It's available as a PDF. And I'd highly encourage you to explore her work because she's doing so much to kind of boil algorithms down to their basics, not just so that we can learn about them, but also so that we can try to reorient them and change the ways in which they are surveilling us. But for this project, she took a number of photographs that were born analog. So these are family photographs that only she had in her, in her shoebox under her bed. And then she uploaded them, scanned them, and uploaded them into Google reverse image search. And these in the background here are what Google, and therefore what Amazon Turk workers, find as visually similar or relevant to this particular image. And Onowoha's point here is to a greater degree about agency. There's a difference between us self-identifying within a group as opposed to being forced into a group or into an identification or into a hashtag by an outside program or programmer. That agency strips us of our humanity, I think she would say, and ultimately misses the point of pictures. And so here, whereas for her, this picture is her and her sister and is so much about that familial relationship, and specifically a familial relationship between two Black women, which the Google image search, of course, can't understand. And instead it focuses, on some cases, on pictures of two people together, Some cases it's pictures of individuals, and we don't really know why. And that kind of inscrutability is a big part of the algorithmic world that we live in. And so I think to maybe start the conversation off a little bit, there's a term that's been coined called the politics of refusal, which means that just because we have this technology doesn't mean we have to use it. And whereas maybe 15 or 20 years ago, we could theoretically opt out of the excess of images, right? We could say, no, I don't want that, that's spam. Today, none of us read the terms and conditions that we click when we gain access to anything. None of us really stop to think about what it means when we, participate in Throwback Thursdays on Twitter or Instagram, and yet all of that information is being gathered and collated and quantified and analyzed by corporations and governments and law enforcement to try to predict us and to try to categorize us. And I think, so the question for me is not how can we eliminate these technologies? We're not going to go back to a world pre-computer. We're not going to go back to a pre-machine vision world. We're not going to go back to a pre-digital photography world. But how can we as individuals make changes in our own lives, or potentially advocate outside of our own lives for a more human-centered image world? And I think there I'll stop and I'll open it up. And David, maybe you want to take over, and I'll stop sharing my screen. But of course, you can put up other images as people want to see them. Yeah.
Thank you, Dan. That was a really. Oh, can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you, Dan, for that overview of a lot of the work you've been working on and looking at. I think there's a lot there to unpack and to get us started. And in many places, I think first, just a quick question from the chat, maybe you can answer for us. And actually, I can answer this as well, because in a previous life, I was an art installer, and one of the first pieces I installed was Penelope's Sunsets at the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago. We did not use a laser level. We were a lot more loosey-goosey back at that institution. But did she give any instructions on sequencing or order or anything like that? Or was
Very much so, yes. Every picture is specifically laid out. She has a program that she uses to specifically lay out and order all of the images. Every single one is numbered. So we had to, of course, number all of the prints that we created, and then also keep track of that for future references. And so what's interesting is that for our collection, we have, of course, the digital documentation. We have the image files. We have the numbering system and the diagram that Penelope created for the piece. And we also kept a set of prints because we're worried that at some point drugstores will no longer make photographs and we won't be able to ever print these things again. So in order to maintain that kind of, which is crazy, that nostalgic sense of like the 24-hour print processing from the drugstore, we actually printed out in 2016 or whenever that was, a set of prints, and now keep that in an archivally humidity and temperature controlled setting, because we don't know what's going to happen to photographic printing in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes to a number of questions, and again, anyone feel free to chime in on the chat or anything like this, but maybe I'll just start with a couple thoughts or questions I'm kind of having about all of these processes and thinking about the Wilson piece and the Zylinska piece. I mean, I think a lot of this gets to an anxiety that I certainly have, which is just like, there's too many pictures and it's overwhelming, and kind of what are we supposed to do about it? Like, it feels kind of urgent that we respond in some way. I really liked in the Wilson piece, which is kind of different, right? That he feels like there's something happening, right? There's this huge photographing, documenting, image capturing project, and he's worried about a number of things about it in terms of who's doing the labor and what are the images being used for. And all this stuff, and you can sort of reading his sort of first person narrative, it feels like he's expressing that he ought to be doing something about it, right? That it's kind of out of control, and he wants to find some process of taking control back. And in a way that I see a lot of Trevor's work or Penelope's work, and some of these installations are almost sort of illustrating the problem, or illustrating the situation in ways that make it really clear and powerful, like how many photographs are uploaded on, you know, Flickr a day, or like, right, like they're almost like trying to, you know, in some ways they sort of remind me of the this building is this many statues of liberties tall, right? Like trying to put the sheer kind of unfathomable tonnage of images in some kind of way that we can understand, which is nearly impossible and unfathomable.
I think it's a great point, and also I don't know if anyone. I subsequently went and you can. It's on Vimeo. You can watch the video that he created once he was comfortable releasing these videos that he had made, and he delivered. You know, it's just two stationary views of Google headquarters. It's super boring as imagery, but he delivers this very monotone narrative. But in it, he then sort of unpacks all of the surveillance that went on in the course of him getting fired, and it was basically an entire week of time, and God knows how many people's lives were upended by this one guy taking pictures, but it took an entire week for Google Legal and the contracting company that he worked for to eventually just fire the guy. And we all knew that was going to happen, but the way that it's couched and the way that it's handled, it's insane, and I think it's a good metaphor for what you're talking about.
Well, maybe here's a more direct. Yeah, I mean that the whole sort of surveillance state around the piece is pretty insane, and those campuses are very intense and kind of illustrate what's happening. But maybe something that you alluded to at the beginning of your talk, Dan, which was what you sort of mentioned, whether or not you still believe in human photography or human images, and you kind of Zylinska mentions, I think pretty early on in the piece, that a human photograph, or that all photographs are non-human photographs. I mean, and I've come to think of it myself as a little bit of a spectrum of how much humanity could be in any given photograph. But where are you standing, especially after all this work on these highly automated, artificially intelligent projects, in terms of how much humanity can we expect from a photograph, or hope to get from a photograph?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think I'm still trying to process it. I think one of the quotes that I think about a lot in this conversation is something that Trevor says all the time, is that today, in our current contemporary moment, every day, more pictures are made by machines for other machines to interpret than were made like in the entire history of analog photography. And so so that's about like this thing, which for all intents and purposes is just glass and metal, but powered by machines that, again, they're so inscrutable, we don't really know what goes on behind them. And so I think that it's correct that there's something non-human about a picture being taken, because at least and I think most people are using this machine in some way to take a picture, and we have no idea what it's actually doing. I don't know what it's doing. I don't know how it takes a picture. I don't know how it then makes that picture go out into the world and get turned into a meme or whatever, but it's happening. And so I think that it's right that there is this kind of non-human element. And I don't want to be like the boomer who's like, oh, I remember the good old days when you just put in the film and you wound it and you heard the mechanical click. But it does make me yearn for that mechanical age when you knew, and it's not like I understood how the hypo worked. I don't know how the chemicals worked, but I at least could like experience some tactile or physical way of making.
Yeah. So two things. If you know, one is just thinking about, I was lecturing for a history of photography class I teach on, and talking about the beginning of the Eastman Kodak company, and how when the Kodak camera, sort of the first film loaded, send it off, get your pictures back, like sealed black box that made pictures come into your life came out, it was a kind of similar response of like, well, I don't need to know how it works, and maybe there's some upsetting implications, but you know, here we are, right, in this new era of photography where things just happen, right? The sort of you know, and the slogan of Kodak was, "You press the button, we do the work," right? Like the work is removed from the consumer and it is kind of industrialized and taken somewhere else. It appears we may have lost Dan.
I'm back here. Can you hear me?
Back there. You've
I'm back.
moved
Sorry,
away.
I have really bad internet right now for some reason, but I'm here.
And the other thing that I found really charming about the Zylinska article is when she does talk about art photography, or sort of dismissively mentions kind of human photography, she goes through the categories of like, oh, like a frayed piece of thread and some sunlight on a carpet. They're just these really, you know, like, you know, that sort of made me feel like perhaps some of this is a bit more subjective in terms of how she's thinking about photography. Maybe Liz, I'll call on you as the kind of picker of this article. Where have you found yourself in terms of the sort of human possibility in photography lately?
Well, I keep thinking about one of the things that Dan has said, what's the point, right? And I think this is related to what we were talking about last time. And I think I was very much holding on to sort of the optimism of it all, optimism of a new technology, and thinking about Andrew Norman Wilson's project being something at kind of the most nascent part of a technology being developed, you know, like the scanning of books, where the process didn't become too sophisticated, so that like there are these moments when human fingers and hands kind of enter the scanning pages and there's still traces, or even thinking about like you know, mechanical Turks, like these people who are like fueling and making things work behind the scenes. I'm thinking about how like these things are at the very onset of a technology, not perfected, and humans have not become 100% part of the machine just yet. And like these are the moments of, I guess, puncture, these like opportunities for us to seize and sort of and think through like what this all means. And I guess because we're in this sort of endless cycle of always trying to introduce new technology, we're never going to be short of an opportunity to punch holes into something that is just starting to you know, come into being. I think the idea of, for me, resistance, or the idea of, maybe it's not even refusal, because in some ways we have to participate in it in order to actually like figure out how to manipulate a system, or to undo some of that. You know, I think about like at what points we can sort of find the opportunity to yeah, kind of think about the undoing, and whatever that may manifest to.
That also just kind of reminds me of a particular section in Zelinda's text, in which she essentially describes like photography's proximity to life, and how she kind of mentions a lot how photography and photography as a medium is not necessarily just to be used by humans, but to create something, but is also in turn it creates us through kind of how we perceive and interpret images. And then that kind of just has me thinking about how like photography then in terms replicate behavior, and how all of those things kind of get done via algorithms, and how we kind of see and use images that come to us almost. So that really has me thinking a lot of about how some of these algorithms can be biased, and how that goes back into how it really does come down to the people that are creating the technologies that we do see the images through, because all of those things, whether we are conscious of them or not, are then codified and internalized into the systems that then take the images to us, and then we see them, and it kind of this vicious cycle keeps happening. So it's just really, and that, I think that really ties back into the question that Yola mentioned in the chat, that there really is kind of a privileged work about the machine, in that it is really those that have access to creating these different types of algorithms that really have a way of affecting the rest of us in view of what kind of images we see and in turn respond to.
Um,
Can I just jump in really quick, David?
yeah, of course.
Joe, I think it's a great point. And Yola, if you're on the call and comfortable speaking, I'd love to hear from you a little bit about your comment, because I think it's really interesting. And what I guess what I'm grappling with is this idea of privileging technology over human uses, because where do you draw that line? And so I'm thinking specifically of the practice, and I probably should have brought it in, but forensic architecture is a collective based in London that I don't even know what they call their practice, but it's something like humanistic journalism. But they've done things like sourced and used the metadata of people's cell phone pictures and video footage of moments like police brutality at the U.S.-Mexico border, for example, and use artificial intelligence to identify things like tear gas canisters within those pictures. And it's the technology that enables a sort of concern for a cause that is very human. And so Yola, I'd love to hear you maybe talk about like where you would draw the line between the technical and the human.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. It's super interesting what, everything you're talking about. I was responding to maybe what I sensed as an anxiety coming from you, Dan, about the question, because I have to say, I taught the non-human photography book last summer in St. Petersburg, not this past summer, but the previous summer in St. Petersburg. And I found, like I've been interested in post-humanism, non-human uses of photography. And I absolutely have to say, to Jill's point about how the technology controls, that's such an important thing to acknowledge as an underpinning of where the whole conversation comes from. But I also found, like in Joanna's book, this kind of blind spot, or like a real lack of knowledge, for me as a photographer and photography educator, about like the history of photography, diverse uses of photography, like how does Gordon Parks use color? I was just reading something in the New York Times today about a painter who was responding to Gordon Parks' depiction of Black subjectivity and masculinity, right? Like when you delve into a particular artist, and there's this whole kind of world, affective world that's being expressed, that's also super important, and probably part of why we care about photography at all. And there's another book, I don't know if you've seen, The Social Photograph, by, I forgot, but another kind of media theory person. So like I see these books that on one hand are dealing with these interesting questions, and on the other hand, like to your anxiety, Dan, like, well, what about the human use of photography? And that, so like as I observe sometimes curatorial decisions at institutions, and I'm an educator, but I'm also an artist, and one thinks about what's being shown, you see a lot of this work that has this kind of meta narrative about technology, but then you have the question of like, oh, well, what is the kind of the personal, and you were saying you have an issue with the word vernacular, but that kind of like expressive use of the photography, and is it kind of, is it just, it's not seen as widely. I'm thinking of another show I got to see at SF MoMA last year about like also something that had to do with surveillance themes, but there was the artist, why am I blanking on her name right now, who did Flint is Family.
Latoya Ruby Frazier.
Yeah, and it's just like, it's like, oh, she has to carry the mantle for photography like single-handedly. And I know that Carnegie did had the Dina Lawson show, but like you're seeing such a thin sliver of work, and then you see Penelope Umbrico like all the time. So anyway, so that's just maybe how I'm thinking about it from the other side, about the sorry to speak for so long, about the question of the expressive. And maybe like what I think about is, how do you kind of like acknowledge those meta questions of data control? And I linked to the book that I highly recommend about the cost of connection, which explores these issues more broadly, in the chat box. But also like make room for human voices.
Yeah, thank you.
I think on that note, one of the things I'm wondering about, how that question's being phrased is, one is one of context, right? Like, we're kind of talking about art museums largely in these articles, and some of these artists are thinking through art about how images exist in the world. And I sort of had the thought that, perhaps it's not so much that Zylinska is dismissive of these images. I mean, although she kind of is, but more so that talking about how kind of the artistic image is just such a infinitesimally small subset of images as compared to this new powerful, ominous type of image that's kind of coming online in the world. And the other thought I wanted to point out was, thinking about kind of, to Melissa's point about sort of the apparatus and control in the chat, which was that I actually, I've seen Penelope's work installed many times, and it's obviously a very popular piece that's had a long life and a lot of installation lives. And I would keep thinking that people keep coming back to it because it actually is a really joyful installation to me. And it feels really, to me, it is kind of a celebration of photography. And it's, even though the image is kind of dumb that people like to take of sunsets, it just is sort of like a celebration of the photograph of the sunset. It's something we all do and we all like doing. And it's like, photography is wonderful in that way. Although obviously a lot of the stuff that Trevor and other people are pointing out is quite insidious and terrifying.
Yeah, Kim also put in a chat, Kim Beck says, the non-human photograph aggregated from Flickr by Penelope is actually the sum of many human individual photographs. Kim, do you want to jump in and add anything to your comment?
I guess when I read this, I kept arguing with her non-human, thinking about all the, I mean, Dan, you pointed to this with Amazon Turk, all the humans that are invisible behind the process. And I guess I kept thinking about that as well, that, all the people who operate the surveillance cameras. Yes, it's, Google's algorithm blurred the shoes and not the face. So there are moments where things are indeed changed from some computer learning algorithm. But there are so many people who operate cameras that it just, I mean, I think she's being intentionally cheeky and pushing it to ask us to think about the non-human instead of the human element behind it. And maybe it's the eternal optimist in me, because I am such an inherently optimistic person, that I kept seeing the humanity in the surf, in these other places. I mean, the one thing that strangely in two different lectures in classes today, people brought up glissant and the act of refusal, the refusal to fix things, the refusal to fix identity. And for some reason, that is resonating with me with this right now, thinking about the refusal to be either human or non-human. Now I'm really rambling, but I just kept finding myself thinking about the people behind the cameras.
I think it's a really great point, Kim. And Glisson is really an interesting figure to bring in here. I know it wasn't part of the reading, but his specifically somebody like Manthia Diawara, who's looked at Glisson for the term of opacity, and the visibility is the other side of that is visibility. But what also comes with there's this term called surveillance, which is essentially using the tools of computers or surveillance of machines to affect change or to do something that they weren't intended to do. And in fact, there are artists, somebody like Mimi Onowoha, for example, who say that in some ways, the fact that they have been ignored or that people of color have been ignored or excluded or adversely impacted by so much of the sort of excess of images actually gives them a bit of a privileged position in trying to upend the apple cart, as it were, and to try to assert a new kind of way of looking. So I do think that it's a relevant reference.
Yeah, I guess this is the kind of loophole in technology, especially the nascent state of technology, that I am always searching for, and am always happy to see that somebody has taken advantage of to kind of reveal the inner workings, because that's how you can cut through to the innards of a beast, I guess. And I think about also what a lot of people have been touching on, and what David was talking about, sort of the need to sort of physically materialize something in order to kind of actually understand, like the mound of just printed out images. And I think for me, like that's going back to art, even though art is a very small percentage of images produced, as talked about. To see art in a physical space, that is a sort of an experience that is kind of incomparable to like this experience that we're having, to physically understand something, to stand in front of an object, even if that object is a screen, tiny or big. I think that experience is really something that to me kind of points to a lot of the sort of the physical material reality. And I also want to say that, like, for me, a successful museum experience is not necessarily the ones that kind of hide its own labor. I think for me, the more we acknowledge the labor of the museum, the more successful and enriched our experience of the artwork is. So I love seeing things like, Penelope's photographs going up, because it is a lot of work.
I think that's really interesting in the context of the Wilson piece too, right? Which is thinking about Google literally trying to hide the labor, especially of the people of color working in the scan ops department, right? And kind of denying that they exist and denying that any labor, right? Like their kind of intention was to make it look like this this books project just existed naturally. And when someone tried to call attention to the laborers and the labor of creating it, it was seen as a threat by them. And so I think perhaps that kind of gets to some of the core of a lot of these projects, right? Which is making visible the methodologies and the labors of this artificial intelligence, because it's such a powerful tool for helping us understand kind of what's going on, right? It is an instructive, kind of didactic, really affecting methodology, a kind of artistic tool for me, certainly. Well, it appears it appears we're all at a loss for words. So maybe that's a sign to wind down tonight. So a couple kind of closing announcements. We will be doing this again at the end of the month. It'll be on a Wednesday instead of a Tuesday, and we'll be looking at we'll be doing topic 3, which is listening to photographs. That'll be Wednesday, October 28th. We'll still start at 5:30. And it'll be facilitated by Dawit Petros, which will be another really wonderful session. We'll also make this recording available in the next couple of days, so feel free to look for that. And anything I'm forgetting, Emily?
I will make one announcement though. I will say Dawit Petros, our next guest facilitator, has a show up, an exhibition up at UV Art Galleries for those of you who are in Buffalo. And it's a beautiful looking exhibition with lots to think about, especially our topic that we'll explore. So come visit us. We're open by appointment Thursday through Saturday, 11 to 5. And yes, Emily has kindly dropped in a link where you can make your appointment right now.
Can I oh, sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, Dan, you should plug all these.
Yes, I'm going to plug. Thank you. I'll put in a link too. I guess I should. But for those of you, I mentioned Mimi Onowoha's work, and I mentioned that People's Guide to AI. I'll have to track down that link. But Mimi and her collaborator Diana Nucera, who goes by the name Mother Cyborg, are leading a set of 3 workshops online called separately Algorithms and Social Spaces, AI and Speculative Fictions, and Machines That Learn. And I think these are going to be really fascinating ways to unpack some of the ways that algorithms and machines are working today, and maybe some of the ways that we can advocate for change or for a more human-centered approach. So they're free, and you can find out about them and register for them via the link that I just put in there. Please do join us, and again, feel free. Also on the website there, you can find out more about Trevor's exhibition. Stay tuned for the book that I mentioned coming out in December, and we're also going to be releasing a podcast in the beginning of December. It's hosted by Martine Sims, and it's featuring a lot of conversations with interesting people who have come up today and beyond, and that'll be available on the museum's website and wherever you get podcasts. So.
Yep. And one more super quick announcement. We are making the video for session 1 available on YouTube. So if you missed photographs from 1829, scratch that 2020. It will be available on YouTube, and we will also have the second session available coming up. And then we invite you to fill out the questionnaire. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to do that. And if you want to stay connected with UB Galleries, feel free to sign up for our newsletter. So I'll be dropping all of that into the chat right now.
All right. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming. And thank you so much, Dan, for leading our discussion tonight. It was
Thank you for the invitation. Thanks so much, everyone, for your participation.
All right.
Be well.